I got a teleprompter, so my videos will no longer be an erratic series of
gel cats.
Although I'm sure nobody noticed those sorts of things. Playing RPGs is fun, and should absolutely be fun above all else. Running games is a mixed bag, the trick being to find the style that works for you. Something D&D actively works against, but I've talked about that in other videos. There, we got bad-mouthing D&D out the way early, let's move on. I've talked before about how I think lazy players are a big problem, particularly in more D&D style games. It is, in my opinion, the biggest contributor to GM burnout and the perceived shortage of dungeon masters. But it's important to clarify what I mean, and what types of games I'm talking about, because plenty of general advice for running games is available on YouTube, but I want to be a little bit more focused, so what I'm saying isn't going to work for every table. So if you don't like my advice, that's fine, I probably wouldn't enjoy playing in your games either. When I say lazy players, I mean firstly players who don't put the effort in to keep the game alive. It seems to by default fall on the GM to be the parent of the group, on top of having to understand the game the most and doing the most work while playing. This is why games fall apart, and whilst my Monday night group sometimes has serious lapses, having a fixed game night every week really helps take a lot of that stress. It's easier for us to cancel rather than it is to try and desperately organise a game at a random time every few weeks. But that's a logistical issue. Mechanically speaking, players at an absolute minimum should know how their character's abilities work. But if you know me, you know I don't really care about that. All that D&D crunch is boring. My players need to know how their abilities work, mostly because I don't care enough to look them up. So if you're playing a game with a lot of crunch, that's a decision that you made. Learn your shit. If you don't know how one of your character's abilities works, the DM should be allowed to declare automatic failure. But that's my hang-up. I'm here to talk about narrative because that's what interests me. And if it doesn't interest you, then, well, still keep watching because I need the views. Views are all I live for now. And whilst there is no shortage of videos about how GMs can make their games more interesting, just by virtue of being a GM, you're probably bringing quite a lot to the table already. And if the game is boring, it could just be because your players are being boring. That's not to say that when a session goes badly, or we don't get to all the plot points I thought we would, that I don't immediately turn my hatred inwards like a good little manic depressive that I am. But I also dish out blame to my players. Not to their faces, of course, except in passive-aggressive ways that probably aren't as subtle as I think they are. But I've come to a healthy recognition that not everything is my fault. Other people suck too. I should put that on a t-shirt. Be merch. What a psychological roller coaster. Am I healthy or not? Who can tell? You know what, the town council can't be trusted. We should just blow the whole thing up. We do have an entire cart full of dynamite. I mean, it does feel like these people are all conspiring against us. Okay, yeah, no, you can blow up the council. That's one way to deal with your problems. You're probably going to need to find somewhere to hide out though in the city. You know, like Mickey the Alchemist. You also know that the Thieves Guild have been looking to recruit a lot lately, so you could have an in there. You know what, I'm tempted to say screw this town. I think we've been burnt too many times. We've made too many enemies. This is only going to make things worse. I think maybe we've got to head out. I mean, sure, yeah, you can do that. There's plenty of places to go. You've got the capital to the east. Your hometown is to the south, of course. You know that the Elven territories to the north. You've heard a lot about them. There's a lot going on there. There's too many bad memories here. What if we just steal a boat and head out to sea? There's a hip fishing village just to the south. Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, you steal a boat, head out onto the open sea. Yeah, what do you want to do? What can we do? What do you mean? What are our options? What can we do now? Okay, so you literally blow up the plot that we've been working towards for weeks. You don't want to interact with any of the NPCs or locations of the city that you've been questing in. You don't want to explore your homelands or the other territories that you've heard of. Instead, you want to sail out to sea to do whatever you want. And when I ask you what you want to do, you want me to give you options. You know what? It's fine. I have actually prepared for this. Not to panic. I've got something prepared. I've got something that you can do. Yep, here it is. Here it is, yep. I feel it reflects badly on us that he had that already made. What I'm saying is it's not always the GM's job to keep the momentum of the game going. Some players are more than happy to derail the GM's plans, but apparently lose interest when they actually have to make a decision. Honestly, I'd love my players to interrupt the game in downtime or lulls in action with some bullshit I hadn't prepared for. I'm such a big improviser, I actually need it in order to fuel the game. If I'm running a game and I pause for input, it's because I don't know what's going to happen next, and I need a minute. If you've got something you want to add in that moment, then great. But my brain works in a weird way, hence this video series. For now, let's look at two general examples. If your GM has created a complex and varied battle map, an array of monsters, some of them custom built, and a devious big bad, but all you're doing is walking up to the nearest enemy and hitting them, combat's probably going to be a bit of a slog. Granted, walking up to the thing and hitting it might be your best move, and mechanically efficient depending on your system, but you can't complain if you're bored of how boring you are being. Because this isn't a video game. There's not an efficiency quota to beating the enemy. This is a game of imagination. You can make moves that affect the battlefield, that incapacitate or distract the enemy in other ways, even moves that multiply the damage you're doing on a logical level rather than a mechanical one. You should be able to do things that sound logical rather than be limited to doing things with a mechanical definition. Otherwise, you might as well be playing a video game. If you want to make the best use of the mechanics, then fine, but you are deliberately limiting your options and have to be okay with the GM dictating failure. Now this is somewhat indicative of why D&D doesn't work for me. Combat just isn't designed to be run in a creative way. It can be run that way, but there is an efficiency quota to it that's just kind of boring, and it makes players boring. But if you're the kind of person who loves spreadsheets and balancing their taxes, then I'm sure optimizing your moves will be enough to entertain you. But I'm not the first person on YouTube to attempt to fix combat. I'm just one of the few pointing out that this is actually an issue of D&D programming its players to make the least interesting choice. So if you want more interesting combat, make more interesting moves. Moves that maybe aren't the most efficient use of your character's time. Because the secret is that a good GM is continually balancing the game in the name of logic rather than mechanics. They aren't necessarily balancing it in your favour, but the beauty of playing these games instead of playing a video game is that the difficulty curve can continually be adjusted. You don't need to hit the enemy with your biggest gun to hurt it, and if you do, but fail, you shouldn't feel like you just wasted your only option. Critical Role is one of the best examples of this. Matt has admitted that the players have occasionally latched onto an environmental detail during a battle that he hadn't anticipated. It was just flavour he had added in the description, or something on the unnecessarily elaborate battle map. But instead of the players just hitting the thing, they attempted a creative solution, one that the GM could very easily say no to in a crunchier system simply because there aren't rules for it. Board games, and by extension war games, have heavy restrictions on what the players can do, because maximising your efficiency is the point. Within an RPG, if you could logically do something in that situation, assuming that you were a magical elf in a dystopian demiplane or whatever, then that thing you want to do should work. You should never hit an invisible wall of progress, and you should be encouraged to make these more creative moves. Maybe save your big mechanics-based moves for later in the fight. Finish the boss off with a well-placed high-level spell, but for the first half of the fight, just try and swing the environment and circumstances to your advantage. If you want cinematic flavour to your game, then your GM should work with you to achieve that, because the mechanics are unlikely to give it to you. I personally prefer systems that encourage and reward that kind of play without it being the exception to the rule, but it's hard to learn that way of playing. Mechanics-led systems program players to think inside the box because it's easier to do that. But that is where the vast majority of problems that other YouTubers attempted to address come from. They just rarely mention it. The other one I've seen addressed multiple times is travel, but it's kind of a stand-in for general downtime. Time in the game when the players are not able to immediately achieve one of their goals and must run out the clock until something changes. More cinematic games solve this problem quite easily by just not having these moments. If something interesting isn't going to happen till the next morning, well, then we just skip till the next morning. But I can see how the more D&D style of making every moment of your character's life be important seems more immersive. In those instances, the GM skipping ahead and saying, oh, you went home, had some food, went to bed, and now you're at the King's Council Chambers the next day ready for your meeting with the High Guard. That could feel like robbing the players of agency, even if you're only skipping a load of pointless crap they didn't really care about anyway. Again, Critical Role handles this very well, and that's partly due to the players. The problem with travel is that you want traversing the land to feel epic, particularly in a fantasy setting where walking from one city to another is a time-consuming experience. It's easier to get that in a video game where physically moving about the world acts as practice for the game's mechanics, and you can admire the design of the terrain. But that isn't so true when you're sitting around a table eating leftover pizza and staring at grid paper. But even in video games, you eventually come to rely on fast travel because it was fun to run across the frozen tundra the first time, but you haven't got all day to play and you want to get to the point. So whilst Matt runs random encounters to spice up travel, flashing out the world and even introducing plot threads that may come into play later, these take time, and unless like Critical Role you can guarantee you're going to be playing next week, you might not be keen to waste the only session you've managed to arrange in the last 2 months fighting random bandits on the road to the location you'd rather be at. This is where the cast come in. They will jump on a moment of downtime as soon as it appears, purposefully prompting small character moments and even openly requesting the chance to converse with the other characters, be they players or NPCs. Granted, the show is doing that because they know they are a show and they want to perform for the audience, but they're also doing it because they want to perform for each other and because they genuinely enjoy it. And it's fun, especially if you're playing a character-led game where you have secrets from the other players. I'm not suggesting that you do this as much as the Critical Role cast do, that might be silly, but little moments of this can serve to pad the runtime, as it were. A random aside will feel longer than it actually is and help create the illusion of time passing. Obviously this only works if you're running a narrative-heavy player story-led game, but as I've said in previous videos, I think the popularity of actual play content has exposed that that's the kind of game a lot of new players want to be running. So if you're on a long journey, take control, spark in-game, in-character conversation, describe your travel arrangements, where you set camp, what you contribute when setting that camp. Throw out a few ideas for catching food or tracking your opponent or whatever it is that you need to do in that moment. And in combat, do something interesting. If you're relying on the GM to flavour your actions, then you don't get to complain about having a lack of agency. You voluntarily gave it up. And once you get used to faking these kinds of moments, you'll start doing it on instinct and it won't feel so contrived anymore. Because if there's one thing I'd like players to leave this video understanding, it's that cinematic moments do not happen organically. For example, there's a trope called refusing the call, which is the moment that the protagonist declares they can't do this anymore or they don't want to step into danger. It's shortly followed by an eye-opening bare-wall talk with a mentor figure or the horrible slaughtering of their immediate family that drags them right back in again. This is pretty much impossible to organically achieve in a role-playing game, though it would be really interesting and very immersive. It's generally something that would appear in someone's backstory having already happened. And the reason this is impossible is because players just f**k around. I'm not coming out against f**king around, it's fun to f**k around, but you can't do it and expect big cinematic moments. These moments are incredibly contrived and totally staged, and if your GM tries to set one up and it doesn't work, it's likely because you ruined it, you dingus. A perhaps more digestible example is wit. Think of your favourite TV show and your favourite witty character. Your Dr. Houses, Ron Swansons, Chandler Bings of the world. I'd even give you Stewie Griffin. Well, guess what? Those characters aren't that witty, and the people who write them probably aren't that witty either. Because, and I hate to break the illusion, they also wrote the setup. When Dr. House delivers a sick burn, he's not reacting to a real person or catching someone out in a real lie. He's speaking a contrived line of dialogue that is only clever because the previous contrived line of dialogue was written to be slightly dumber. TV shows are fake. Even the ones that pretend they aren't are pretty fake. So those big cinematic moments aren't going to happen unless you play along. You can even tee them up yourself. Setting up a joke is a skill just as much as hitting a punchline is. I'm praising Critical Role a lot in this video, but the players are what make that game so good. They will make the wrong choice. They will choose story over mechanics because they know that's what real power is. You can grind your min-maxed OP character build to victory, and the cast can be pretty good at doing that as well, but that's just book learning and dice rolling. It's not creative. It's like solving a Rubik's Cube. It's not that impressive, you can just Google how to do it. So if you want to confront another player or NPC or wrestle with your character's demons, you can just say that's what you want to do. And if a player at your table does that, don't try to derail them. Yes and doesn't literally mean saying yes and, even though that's generally how it's depicted on TV. It means building on what a fellow player has said instead of ignoring it or worse, undermining it. And importantly in this context, letting them take centre stage if needed. Players need to be prepared to lead the game, take control of the narrative. Not entirely, of course, you can't dictate NPC behaviour or solve quests just because you say so, but you can be more assertive about your place in the world. Make interesting choices over efficient ones, embellish your actions and encourage rewarding others for doing so. Know when to step up and when to take a back seat, and don't be afraid to add a little flavour. Don't assume that you can only see and do the things the GM tells you that you can only see and do. If it won't break the game to declare a detail about the environment, then feel free to do so. And if you're in a forest, say, I climb a tree, instead of asking, is there a tree I can climb? Because the stupid questions are annoying and they slow everything down. Ultimately, it will relieve some pressure from the GM, immerse you deeper, and importantly, be fun. It'll also show you that running the game isn't so scary. It's just a few steps of creativity above being a player. There we have it, another video from me. I hope that was helpful and not too harsh. I hope there's something interesting in there or some talking points you hadn't really thought of. Please do like and subscribe to the channel. Check out my other videos in this mini-series and in all my other videos that I've made. Some of the actual play stuff that we've got going out, some of the old stuff. The teleprompter is starting again for some reason, so it's just going to cycle back through the beginning. That's very confusing. If you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-Fi support link below. We're just taking any donations at all. Just give us £2. £2 for a cup of coffee. It all goes to supporting the channel and building our equipment up and hopefully making more and more content. I can't believe how easy that was. That was so easy. That was like 20 minutes. It normally takes me like 3 hours to film one of these videos because I have to keep stopping and starting and looking at the script, and it just drives me insane. I should have bought this months ago. It's so good. Oh my god, why did no one tell me?